Hello awesome patrons, I hope you're doing well. This is your first video reward for the month of July, and I wanted to practice layering, shading while doing a floral watercolor painting. I almost always start now by adding clean water on my surface, whether I spray it or I add drops of clean water with a paintbrush. I find it kind of gives me a good starting point. It's not the same as starting on a dry surface, because right off the bat you see the paint kind of moving around randomly, and this is what I like. Now usually I paint intuitively, but for this one I had an idea in mind. So right off the bat you can see that I have the makings of flowers. So this one was a little bit more intentional. The way I approached the painting, however, changed a couple of times, I want to say, during the process. So I'm using this oval brush. It's a 3/4 inch brush, and I think I'm going to use this brush more often. I don't use it all that often, but I realize now that when I do a bigger painting, as opposed to what I'm doing daily, the smaller ones that I do for YouTube, when I work in a larger surface, I kind of like to use a big brush to start off with. And not only is this brush big, but it's not flat. It has a pointy tip. So it kind of like acts as a dual, it has dual purposes in a way, or purpose. Whichever, you know what I mean. So I can cover large surfaces, but I can also get into the nooks and crannies, much like I'm doing right now. I'm adding paint around the middle white spot that I left there, and it just allows me to do that beautifully. Now, the first part of this video is going to be done almost non-stop, which means that I'm painting, or I'm establishing the flowers and the background at the same time while everything is wet. So I'm not allowing anything to dry for now, and that's because I want to see the colors move into each other. And I'm also going to be fading the background to nothing, so that's all happening at the same time. I'm working on Arches rough grain texture 100% cotton paper, watercolor paper. I'm not sure I said that correctly, but it's Arches rough grain cotton. That's all you need to remember. And I keep forgetting how much I love this paper. It's just such a joy to work with, especially for blending colors, because it does stay wet for a while. It absorbs the color really well. The colors stay vibrant. If, however, you like to do line drawing like I enjoy doing as well, or doodling, this might not be the best paper because of the texture. But for this kind of painting that I'm doing right now, it's perfect. I just want to talk about the colors a little bit, but just know that the supplies lists are included as an attachment to this post. To start off with, I used shell pink, then I dropped in some yellow brilliant #1, quin coral in the center, and a little bit of quin burnt orange around, like in just a few spots on the flowers. And for the background, I'm using lunar blue, which is a granulating color. So as you can see, right now I'm establishing the background. So just keep in mind that the flowers are still wet and the colors are still going to mingle with each other, and that's fine. They're going to run into each other, but they're going to create beautiful, I mean, I'm not using at this point the lunar blue in its full pigmentation. It still washes. So if the colors of the flowers run into that blue, it just gives me that beautiful subtle look that I like. Now, I have to say that the look of this painting changed dramatically throughout the video. I was going for more of a, not an abstract, but more of a traditional look, I want to say, at the very beginning. especially for the flowers. I wanted to have flowers that have this little jaggedy fringe, kind of like a carnation flower. And you'll see that I'll end up with something totally different. And that's fine. You know, sometimes the direction of the painting is not up to you to decide. More like, you know, the way you paint, I guess, reveals the way you should go, or it reveals a different process that you should take. So that brush is fantastic, by the way. I have to use it more often because, as you can see, I'm still using that big fat brush, but I'm able to get into the nooks and crannies. So as I'm moving around, like I'm trying to keep my painting wet as much as possible. So sometimes I work on the background, sometimes I work on the flowers, much like now. I'm just intensifying the queen coral in the middle because I really wanted to have that look of a deep, deep center. But at the same time, I'm very mindful to keep my background wet because I want to fade to nothing. And I don't want to have, I kind of want to have a background that is as smooth as possible. So I'm trying to avoid the hard edges. Sometimes they're fun, but for this painting in particular, I didn't want that. So I keep adding washes of the same color, one on top of the other. Of course, in the middle where the background is, where I have a bigger concentration of flowers, the background is going to be darker as well. But in hindsight, because I know how the painting ended up, I wish I had sketched the whole thing, because I'm going to take a few detours to arrive to the final painting that were unnecessary. But as you know, my mission here on Patreon is not necessarily to show you how to do things, although I'm pretty sure some of you are learning at the same time as me, but it's more like I'm sharing my growth as I progressed with watercolor painting. And that is a perfect example. This painting is a perfect example because, as I've said, I've taken a few detours. And I'll make sure that I've left them in, and I'm going to talk about them as the painting evolves. The other thing I wanted to say is that the first step of the painting, which is establishing the flowers and the background, working with the composition, I've left this process in its entirety. But I want to say second half of the video, because some of the steps were repetitive, you will see kind of like a sample of each of the steps, because I have painted a lot of leaves in this project, and if I had left every single step, it would have required maybe 5 cards, because I've recorded this over the span of several days. And so, yeah, but I mean, each step is depicted, but because they're repetitive, there's a single one of each. A little sampling. So again, I'm still working in the background. I think you can see a little bit of that water on the left-hand side where my brush is. You can see how wet this background still is, which allows me to still blend that color beautifully. And eventually, of course, I'm going to let that dry. The way I did this composition is that the darker color is kind of like towards the left, and towards the right up top and at the bottom, I kind of have more of a light coming in, so that's a little lighter. All right, so here's the second part. Now you can see a little bit of that fringe that I was talking about around the flowers, and that's the look I was going for, but it's not going to stay that way, so don't get attached to it. So now I'm darkening the middle, and I'm using my Pentel Fuda Mental brush for this. I'm going to use several brushes, and I'm going to switch back and forth. Sometimes there's no reason for me switching the brush, but like I said, because I did that over several days, sometimes I forget which brush I was using, and you know, Sorry about that. There's never just one way of doing things. So you can use whatever brush you feel more comfortable. Of course, to have a fine tip like this brush really helped in establishing the little fringe around the flowers. And you're going to see in a second that I am trying to paint in a negative way. I'm trying to paint a leaf. And this is when I realize that I'm in big trouble because it was very difficult for me to keep an eye on what was happening in the background because, again, I wanted to have, here it is, here's the leaf. I wanted to keep an eye on how I was painting the background, making sure that I did not stop anywhere in the middle without fading the color. And at the same time, I needed to shape the leaves. I needed to shape the flowers or define the flowers. And I wanted to have several layers of leaves, and I did not know how to do that. Like, I was scratching my head. Am I supposed to start outlining the leaves that are underneath or at the top? Do I start from the top or underneath? It was very complicated. And here is when I decided that that is not the approach I should be taking because it got so confusing. As you can see, like these leaves don't make sense. Like, where's the stem? Where do they come from? So, and I'm using a different brush. That's my number 8 round. So I decided to sketch whatever I needed, whatever elements I needed to add to this. I decided to use a pencil and sketch. And this is where it dawned on me that if I have the drawing, then I can apply the colors to the proper leaves. I can work on the background first without having to worry about shaping the leaves and keeping an eye again on the colors, the color drawing or whatever. So having that drawing allowed me to work in sections. It's kind of like fill in. It's almost like coloring at this point. And you can see that I have an area. I'm going to show it to you, I'm sure. Yeah, right there. See, I did not like these leaves. And so I drew a leaf and I'm going to fix it. So, and I have a few other spots too right there that I need to fix. But having that drawing really helped. And this is the sketch that will be included also as a reward. I will be giving you the sketch of this painting. So if you want to do this at home, if you want to reproduce this painting, you can just use the sketch, print it on copy paper, use graphite paper to transfer over your watercolor paper and avoid unnecessary steps. Just start painting right off the bat. Okay, so I have probably given 3 or 4 different layers of washes over the leaves. Not all of them have 3 or 4 washes, depending on the level they were at, because I have some that are like directly underneath the flowers, some that are deeper, and then again deeper. So I kind of have like 3 levels of flowers, and some of them are different colors as well. I used Cascade Green. I also used, what's the other color I used? Green Apatite Genuine on certain leaves, and also the Lunar Blue. And so while I was applying the color, like, okay, this is hard to explain, but I'm gonna try my best. I'm sorry, guys. So the very first wash that I did after I did the drawing, I kind of applied to everything. And it was a very light wash. So I took Lunar Blue, I put it in my pan or my palette, and I added quite a bit of water to have this very light wash, and I applied it everywhere. So what that did was the areas where I had already darkened, well, of course, that area will be darkened also by that wash. but wherever I did not apply any paint previously, it's going to be lighter. So already it's going to be the start of this multi-layered effect. And every time I added a layer or a wash, I avoided some leaves, the ones that were on top. And then, you know, at the second pass, I avoided the ones that were in the second tier. So I'm working my way from top to bottom, essentially. And here I'm trying to fix this this leaf that had like ghost leaves in the background that I did not like. And so I'm going to keep working in this area, adding or dabbing the paint to cover up. See, when I dab the paint, it doesn't remove it, it just adds it. So as you can see, if you look at the top portion of the video or the painting, you see that I've already worked my way down with this first layer. And how I did this without having any harsh lines is I kind of like painted each section separately, and that way it gave me a small section to work with. So if I needed to stop at any point in time, it didn't matter because I needed that hard edge because it's a leaf, right? Like I painted up until the line. The only exception to this is what I'm doing right now. It's these larger areas where I needed to fade to nothing. And that was the big challenge. So what I would do is I would drop the color like in the area where it needed it the most. Here you can see it, the perfect example. So I'm going around those leaves that I've already painted. I'm not going over them because then that's going to create a harsh line or a difference in the color within that leaf. So I'm just picking up where I've left off. I'm going around the leaves, and then to fade to nothing, I cleaned my brush, and then I kind of like push back the color with kind of like a thirsty brush. Although this paper drinks a lot, so my brush needed to be a little more wet than usual. But that's essentially how I handled everything. So essentially now the first layer of leaves is, or the first wash over everything is done. And then I'm gonna go over with a second wash, but avoiding some of the leaves that are supposed to be on top. I hope this makes sense. I know I'm talking a lot, but I really want to explain my process because I know that I would have liked to have seen a video like this when I was starting out. So there we go. The first layer is done. It's not still, you know, to where I want it, of course, because I have several other layers to do. Now, before I started the second layer, I worked in the areas where, like the deepest, what's in the middle, where there's 3 flowers that meets. I wanted to establish the dark value right there. And the reason why I did that is because I was afraid that in certain areas I was going to lose my drawing. I was afraid that as I add more and more color, I wouldn't see my lines. And so I made sure that these spots were covered. For the most part, I use lunar black, except in the narrowest parts, I also added lunar black because that's the black that I have. But yeah, most of it was done with the lunar blue. And I'm also making sure that I go over the lines in between the petals, because obviously if the petals are spread out a little bit, you would see the background. And since the background is dark, then I use the same color that I use to paint around that flower. I use the same color to delimit these lines. And you see, like I'm stopping right at that leaf. And that's my dark area, and so I can just like work inside that area and not really worry about, oh yeah, I have a leaf there, I'm supposed to make a leaf there, and how do I do this? And oh my gosh, like the rest is drying. And anyways, once I figured out that it was best for me to draw, the whole painting took a different turn and was a lot more enjoyable. So it's kind of like more of an illustrative style, I want to say, it's not an abstract. Definitely not an abstract, but I had the intention of doing that at the beginning. So more dark spots. And here you're going to see that I need to extend that dark color, but blend it into the background, going lighter. And at the beginning I was kind of like struggling, and I figured out at the end how to properly shade without creating that really dark line around a space. That's to come. Not yet. I'm still having fun. But you see how, also, I wanted to mention that some colors are better for shading than others. I noticed that the green gold is, runs. And by running, I mean it flows into the water super fast. So if you're shading with green gold, you're going to see you're going to add a little dot of that color, and it's going to go whoosh, like it will go everywhere where the water is or the wet paint is, and super fast. Whereas the colors that I was using, the lunar blue and the lunar black, not so much. I'm not sure if it's because they're granulating colors, they're Daniel Smith colors. But yeah, and it doesn't depend on the brand of paint that you use. It actually depends on the pigment, I guess. So here I think I was successful in blending to nothing in this little area, so I was very proud of myself. And you know, like anything else, shading is something that I feel that I need to practice a lot before I get super comfortable with it. But I know that by watching this at the same time as you are, well, not at the same time, but you know what I mean. I mean, watching myself paint, I know that I've made some progress since I started watercoloring, which was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I keep thinking it's 3 years, but I think it's 2 years. So for the shading as well, I took different approaches. I think I said that, but one of them is dropping the color onto a dry background and then re-wetting my brush with clean color and blending it out. The other method that I used is adding the water first and then dropping in the color. And I'm not sure which one I prefer. I think the easiest is to wet the area and then drop in the darker color where you want it and see where the paint will run to. But at the same time, when you're using this method, if you add too much paint, it will run too far. And with here's a look after the darkened area. I made sure that I give you the full view with every level, I want to say, so that you can get a better idea of what it looks like. But going back to blending, and so the other method, adding the color on dry and then wetting and to try and get that color to run, that's tricky as well, because if you add too much water, what's going to happen is the water is going to push back the paint that you've added on the dry surface, as opposed to bringing the color into the wet. So both methods have to be practiced. I know that both of them are effective because I've seen artists use both. But again, I still don't know which one I prefer the best. All right, so now that I've decided that these flowers are going to be a little bit more whimsical or stylized as opposed to real, I'm allowing myself to have a little bit of fun. I added black dots in the middle, and as soon as I started adding the black dots, I thought, oh, this looks like a strawberry. And I thought it was fun. But it's definitely, you know, I don't think I've ever made any real flowers ever, but this is totally stylized, and I'm okay with that. I was just having fun at this point. Okay, so this is, I want to say, the second or third layer on the leaves. So these are, like this one in particular is on top, so I made sure that that wash that I'm adding right now is light. I didn't want the leaf to be too dark, and it is wet, so I'm going to drop in more colors, or more color close to the flower to indicate that the leaf is actually stemming from underneath the flower. But I didn't want to create like a huge shadow, of course. But I think what I've done is I dropped in the same color, but just a little bit heavier pigmentation. And then I'm going to be dropping Lunar Blue. Yeah, here it is. I find maybe this approach, like dropping in the color onto wet, is safer in a way than the other way around, which is like dropping the paint in dry and then adding some water, much like I'm doing right now. No, actually, this is me adding another layer onto that flower, the leaf. So here, this is a leaf that's, I want to say, like maybe a second tier leaf, which is like below the lighter ones. And so, of course, the color that I'm adding is a little bit more intensified. There's more pigment. And I've noticed that if I keep adding wet, okay, the same value of color, meaning, and I'm going to show that later. I'm sorry, sometimes I don't make sense, and I hope my babbling doesn't disturb you, but keeping the color wet, I would say inside an area is crucial for blending. Not only like do you have to keep the surface wet, but sometimes by the time that you're done a leaf, let's say, and you're done, you're at the tip, and then you want to add shading where you began, it's wet, but it's not the same wetness, so sometimes it could influence it. And here I'm going to show you exactly the process that I'm trying to explain, but in a bad way. So as you can see, I created the color inside my palette, and this is, I'm not going to add water to it until I'm done painting. So what happens is I'm re-dipping my paintbrush again in the same pool of color. And so essentially I keep adding the same color, the same intensity, keeping it wet as I move forward, going back into the area where I've already painted. But because it's the same value, it's not going to create much variation. And that is the one way that I figured out that adding shading this way is much easier. So as you can see, I'm adding the black here because it's a dark leaf. So I'm adding black, and I found the results much more efficient. And here I'm going to show you the same thing done with a different brush. It's probably another day now. And again, I keep adding that same value, dipping in the same pool of paint that I've prepared and not picking more pigment. It's the same value. And here I decided to add another color on top. But again, I'm making sure that everything is even, and then I'm going to drop the color for shading. And that was the easiest thing for me to do. So like I said, I've discovered a lot of things. And here I want to show you how wet this is. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there was like an area to the left where it was a little bit more wet than everywhere else. And so I'm trying to even that out. But I want to say that at this point, you kind of need to try and avoid going back into it because you might remove the paint. Here as a final step, I wanted to add a gold thread going through this bunch of flowers, and I didn't know how to do it. So I used tracing paper first. I layer it over the painting, and then I kind of like did a mock-up of the thread just to see what it would look like, and I figured out that I liked it. So then I traced a new one with a pencil, and of course I couldn't see my lines. So I had to be creative there, but yeah, anyways, I like the final result, so it's all good. You know me, I can't stop without having some gold somewhere. This is a new brush, by the way. You're going to see it in tomorrow's video on YouTube. Oh no, you've seen it already. I've published this video to you, but this is the Escoda number 4 round, and it comes to a super sharp tip. That's what I used to do the gold thread, and it worked beautifully. I do have a number 4 round. I kind of lied in my video. I kind of realized that this morning that I do have a number 4 round in my stash, but it doesn't come to a fine tip. It's a very fat round. Kind of like a round. It's not a pointy round. But this painting is pretty much done at this point. I'm going to add a few drops of that gold, but I'm not going to overdo it, of course. I didn't want the gold to overtake the painting, but I'm so happy with this painting, and it was just so much fun to do. Once I realized how to approach it, it was almost, like I said, like coloring in and adding shading, and it was just relaxing from that point on. I think of all the paintings that I've previously done, this one has brought me the most experience, because I have figured out how to do things, different things that I was trying to attempt, and of course I took several detours, but for me this is how I learn. I could enroll in an advanced watercolor class, but for me, I think my progress is measured by my mistakes. I learned that way. I've always learned this way. I will research afterwards what I needed to do just to find confirmation of what I did is right. But anyways, that's how I learn, and I hope you don't mind seeing my mistakes. I hope that they bring you some sort of guidance. And I also want to invite you to play with the sketch that I will include as part of your rewards. You can also post your pictures under the community tab. I'd love to see what you guys create. A few of you post, and that's always awesome. And don't restrict yourself to, you know, something that you've made using a sketch. You can post whatever painting you're working on, whatever project you're working on. I'd love to see what you guys create. And so here's a closer look to the painting. Thank you so much, my awesome patrons, for your generosity, for your sweet comments. You make my day, and I love you all. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon.